I want to thank Marvin for that well thought out presentation. And let's just dive right in. A couple things. First off, let's start with the problem of evil. Marvin suggested that an all-knowing, all-seeing, all-powerful, all-loving, a few other adjectives in there, God and evil cannot both exist. But this is simply not true. As a matter of fact, Marvin bears the responsibility to express to us why those two things are connected. Now, it might seem apparent to you as you look at that if he's all-powerful and he's all good and he's all-loving, that he would simply extinguish evil. Let's think about that for a minute. If he were to extinguish evil, what would that look like? See, not only would he have to extinguish actual evil in the world, but he would also have to extinguish all potential evil in the world. Since the world consists of creatures with free will, that includes you and me. And not just you and me, but every single person on the face of the planet. I wonder what we would think of God then. In addition, we can actually argue that the very fact that Marvin recognizes evil is proof not that God does not exist, but that God actually does exist. As a matter of fact, let's just add it to the syllogism I offered earlier. If God does not exist, moral objective values do not exist. Evil exists. Therefore, moral objective values do exist. Therefore, God exists. See, Marvin has to borrow from the Christian atheistic perspective of the world in order to even make the argument of evil. Because you cannot recognize it without objective values. In addition, if we are to suggest that God created the universe and that it is a good thing that we have free will, which could be defined as the ability to do otherwise, and that God's purpose in creating the universe and creating the world and creating indeed you and me is that we would come into a loving relationship with Him. If that is indeed God's purpose, He must also give us the option, if we are to love Him, to also hate Him, to rebel against Him, to turn our back on Him. For without that option, we would be not free and we would not be able to love. We would simply be robots. So actually, the argument for evil and the existence of evil and the existence of a loving God does not make sense, because indeed He is loving and wants nothing more to be in a loving relationship with us. And in creating a world where that is possible, He must have also created a world where evil is possible. Secondly, let's talk about science and religion, or faith and reason, as it may be. Marvin suggests that he gives some examples, and the Pope and Galileo and things like that, about how certain scientists over the centuries have been put to the margins, if you will, or maybe persecuted because of their discoveries or their suggestions. Well, I'm not even going to argue with that. As a matter of fact, I will grant Marvin that point, that those are great injustices. However, does it follow then that faith and reason cannot coexist? The answer is no. Of course not. We can find examples of everybody being put to the margins at some point, in some way in their lives. As a matter of fact, Thaxton and Piercy in The Soul of Science said for over 300 years, between the rise of modern science in the 1500s and the late 1800s, the relationship between science and religion can best be described as an alliance. Sure, there are exceptions. But up until the 19th century, scientists were typically Christians. Believers who saw no conflict between their science and their faith. People like Kepler, Boyle, Maxwell, Faraday, Calvin, and others. The idea of a warfare between science and religion is relatively recent. In addition, science probes the universe. She encounters problems and questions which are philosophical in character, and therefore cannot be resolved scientifically, but which can be illuminated by a theological perspective. The whole idea of science is built on the idea of a world that has order in it. And if we are to think about what would the world look like if God created it, if a highly intelligent being created the universe, what would we expect to see? We would expect to see a world with order in it. And contrary to what Marvin suggested, I think that if we were to look at the world and think of what would the world look like if there was no God? What would the world look like if somehow this came into existence from nothing, which we talked about being logically impossible, but let's just assume for the moment that it did. It came into existence from nothing. It exploded into existence. Would we expect to see an orderly world? I don't think so. We would expect to see chaos. We would expect to see odd things and weird things and rules that had so many exceptions they were hardly worth calling rules and laws. But instead we see order, which is what we would expect to see from an orderly God. So, in reality, an orderly world with laws by which we can live and understand, and science can operate, and reason can operate, the laws of logic, create an environment in which science can flourish and reason can flourish. So contrary to Marvin's suggestion, actually, faith and reason, or science and religion, are not at war. They're not battling for ground. They're like hand in glove. They go together. As a matter of fact, I use some science in my opening arguments. Albert Einstein said science without religion is lame. And religion without science is blind. There are all kinds of questions that science cannot answer, that it requires the aid of theology and philosophy. For instance, why is the world orderly? How can we know the external world? What is truth? What are the laws of logic? What kind of values should be utilized in science? And Marvin referred to this when he talked about people being able to do science and not be put down and put to the side because of it. That's a value statement. It's not something science can answer. Theology can answer some questions, and so can philosophy. The statement about theist says a statement is true because of divine inspiration. When found wrong, God doesn't exist. I would actually argue that one of the roles of science is to help us in our theology, in our understanding of the world in which God created. And when theists get something wrong, then we correct it. And that is exactly what has happened. A critical evaluation. I got to be honest, the very fact that I'm standing here at this debate suggests not only that I am in support of critical evaluation, but I'm willing to submit myself to it. Which, if you've ever thought about doing something like this, it's pretty nerve-wracking. It's pretty nerve-wracking to get up and suggest ideas and arguments for a belief that you have and open it up to someone you know will attack those beliefs in front of a few hundred people. So I'm in favor of this. So Marvin can attack critical people who don't allow critical thinking if he wants to, but that's not me. That's not my argument. That's not my church. That's not the people I represent. So that's a straw man. He can attack that, but that is not what I believe. You talk about fake healing scams and things like that. That's fine. We can use examples, right? I mean, we can use examples of places where faith healers were scamming people or doing evil things and bad things. But again, he must borrow from my worldview in order to even recognize that they are evil. And again, we can also reverse those observations and look at people in history who have done evil and scammy type things that were atheists. Hitler being the prime example. And we could go on. And so we can sit here and argue about who's worse, this person or that person, but I think we should focus on does God exist? And using those examples really are not going to move us forward in this discussion. Talked about the freedom to do scientific work, studies about prayer, and I got to be honest, it was interesting because we talked about God's hiddenness, and it bears the question. I wonder what sign would have been appropriate. What if we had heard a booming voice over the microphone? I mean, would really all the atheists in the room simply drop to their knees and go, God does exist, I repent? Of course not. Instead, they would assume there was some kind of trickery involved. They would assume there was some kind of special effects. They would assume that something was amiss. In reality, God has made himself known, both by the arguments I have suggested and in many other ways. And so we need to ask ourselves the question, who gets to decide how God reveals himself? Is it me? Or if there truly is a God that is intelligent, loving, caring, compassionate, and desires a loving relationship, should he decide how to best draw us into that relationship? If God does exist, I believe it should be him. I look forward to hearing Marvin's response to the arguments I presented. Thank you very much.